men who are likely to be more isolated report isolation less. Because of their training, they're not looking for it out there, so they don't report thinking there's not enough of it out there.
I see what you're saying. That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. So then women also, they will try to connect with others where men don't tend to. They're more likely to go and get resources and support outside of their, immediate network if they need to. And they're also more likely to express some frustration with others' inability to share or help them process their grief.
Mm-hmm.
Which I
Mm-hmm.
found really interesting as I dug into the research around it. Like, oh yeah, like you get the training to do more expressing. So if there isn't enough of a support network, you're going to notice it a lot more.
Versus already being accustomed to not having a support network, so not being
Got your
disappointed.
blinders. Yeah.
Hi, welcome back.
Welcome back. So glad we're here together again.
Yes, so today we are talking about gender constructs and grieving, and how gender and the way that people are raised, given the gender they were raised as, and how people's gender evolves over their life, and how that all of that affects the way that they grieve.
Yeah. I love even the way you set it up. I think it's so important to be clear that what we're talking about are constructs and concepts and cultural training that
Mm-hmm.
informs differences, not inborn differences, not brain differences between any differences in gender, but especially between the sort of normally assumed binaries,
Right,
men and women.
right. So this is to help people understand patterns that they may have given the socialization they were given. It's not to draw clear shoulds and shouldn'ts because of the genitalia someone was born with.
Yeah. Yes. So important to make that clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to just add, sort of in this same space of, like sort of setting up the understanding of what we're going to be talking about here, that regardless of your own gender identity, you may notice similarities in how you're navigating your grief with any of what we mentioned today. So even if, like, you don't identify with the gender that this particular, strategy seems to be most associated with, that's okay. Like, knowing more about how you work is really the bottom line for all that we're hoping to share with you. Knowing more about how you work in your grief. And so whatever, under whichever heading we may name a particular approach or, factors or coping strategies, if you identify with that particular strategy or approach, use that information whether or not you identify with that particular gender, please.
Yes. Yes, 100%.
Also, I just want to make sure that we also mention at the outset here that we're going to wind up focusing, because of the studies that are out there up to this point, we're going to wind up focusing mostly on the sort of traditional gender binary of men and women. There aren't that many studies. I was unable to find any study actually that focuses enough on the differences for other genders within and outside of the traditional binary. When you go looking, what you actually wind up finding mostly in that arena is binary parents and their grief around their transgender children. So that's as far as we've gotten. So in terms of studying the more nuanced differences in how we might respond to.
Anything under the umbrella topic of non-gender conforming and grief is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
So the only thing we've studied around the topic of non-gender conforming and grief is parents grieving. Is it the fact that their children are transgender, or the grieving the old, or grieving them changing genders,
Yeah, that's the main one.
letting go of who they thought their child is?
Yeah, the loss of their
Okay.
original child, so to speak. Yeah,
Uh-huh. Okay.
which I think is fascinating, and I'm sure there's a lot of really interesting research going on there, but it doesn't really touch what we're talking about here today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So there's more research to be done.
Yeah, yes. So we're encouraging that. If you're hearing this and you're someone who does that kind of research, please, write that grant and get the research funding to do this body of research that we so not desperately but seriously need.
Yeah.
Also, I think we're going to be talking about gender differences and what's been noted in gender constructs and how different, how men versus women tend to approach their grief. But we also want to be clear, if we haven't been elsewhere, and I'm sure we will be in the future as we continue on, but there are many factors that affect how one grieves, right? Your own life experiences, the way you communicate or don't, your own personality, the kind of support systems that you have around you, maybe past experiences that you or even your family have with grief, even cultural messaging, which is what we're going to wind up talking about a fair amount here, but even cultural messaging outside of how men do it versus how women do it can also very much affect how we grieve.
Yeah. So to kick it off, what do you think is the strongest cultural messaging that's going on right now?
So, yeah, great place to start. I think one of the most notable differences that I've come across, and it just seems to be reiterated in the various places where people talk about it or written about it or talked about the studies that they've been finding, is that we're going to be using the terms men and women here. I really mean anyone with a penis goes under the category of men because they get that training regardless of how they identify. And anyone with a vulva goes under the category of women because they get that training regardless of how they identify. So at least for this conversation, we'll just keep saying men and women a lot.
Yeah, so what you're saying we're referring to is people who were socialized to be men
Yeah.
as children and people who were socialized to be women as children.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
largely that tends in our culture right now to break down around what kind of genitalia you're assumed to have, if it's
Mm-hmm.
known or assumed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I make that the categories the way I do. But yes, how you're socialized is really the bottom line there. So people socialized as, and we're just going to start saying men and women. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Men, sort of the top line thing that's noted most often is that they tend to go inward and they're not doing a lot of processing outward. And the opposite tends to be true of people socialized as women. They tend to go outward with a lot of their processing. And that's sort of what breaks down as the main defining difference between these two categories of people, groups of people. Have you experienced that too?
Yeah, absolutely. Women are used to going to the bathroom together. Men are used to
Great.
going to the bathroom alone.
Yeah, great example.
When we're
Yeah.
at a restaurant with a mixed group, a
Mm-hmm.
woman will say, "Do you have to go to the bathroom?" And sometimes the answer to that is, "No, but I'll go with you."
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not actually about emptying your bladder. It's actually about having a private little reprieve where you get to check in about something. Or you can say, "Oh, how was that for you?" Or "Did you hear what that person said? Can you believe that?"
Yeah.
So, and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
also goes back to I think that there's research showing that women say so many more words per day
Mm-hmm.
than men do.
Yeah. I'm really glad you're hitting on that. Like the way in which this same dynamic is exemplified in other places in the culture, right? Like just women going to the bathroom together. That's a thing where they like you're saying, they will go in a group a lot of the times, or there's an assumption that like I'm going, so you might come with me, and I'll ask you, or there's a whole apparatus built around that men don't have. Like we're not thinking about whether or not the other men at the table are going to come with us or should come with us or is it a good opportunity for them to come with us to the bathroom. And I'm saying us because that's the kind of training I got too, even though I identify as non-binary. So yeah, men are, I think, from the outset and in many places in their lives trained to use fewer words. And so it's really no surprise that in grieving the same thing actually shows up. They tend to use fewer words or do more processing internally rather than sharing it externally as readily. I guess I also want to say that everything we're going to say may also not be true for you. Like if you're a man or you're a woman, you may have the opposite, right? You may be someone who's like, I'm not sharing my stuff and I'm a woman, or I like to share my stuff all over the place and I'm a man. Please definitely, again, come back to what's true for you if that's true for you. And don't let anything that we're saying here convince you that you aren't who you really are or aren't doing it the way you really, are doing it, or that you should be doing it any differently because of the body that you're in.
Yeah, and I think to further about men going outwards and women going inwards is that women are raised their whole lives talking about our feelings
Hmm.
all the time. And men aren't raised that way. That's considered to be unmanly. And it's very quickly socialized out of little boys that
Yeah,
men don't cry, men don't show weakness.
that's right.
And then when there is a catastrophic event in life that really, really warrants crying and being held and being supported, a lot of men have completely shut off their access to that by the time they were 6 years old,
Mm, yeah,
that they don't have access to those emotions as adults, and then it gets buried and suppressed and turns into the only emotion that they are socially allowed to have, which is anger.
yeah. And only a little bit, like kind of righteous anger. If it gets too scary, oh, that's right out too. And yeah, I think what you're saying there is really important because that means that they may be less likely to recognize emotion because they haven't had as much trafficking in talking about it or expressing it or processing it with others. Like you're saying, they may be more likely to recognize something like anger over the whole other host of emotions that can come up in a grieving process. And when the neural habit is there to suppress, suppress, suppress instead of engage or open up or express, then yeah, they may be much less likely to cry or to express themselves or to process their grief with others, but also just even with themselves because of
Mm-hmm.
the habits they have around not going toward feelings or not going toward expression.
And I think because men are so socialized to not know how to process their feelings, often they will process their feelings with one woman in their life. It might be their spouse
Yeah,
or it might be their mother.
yeah.
And if there's a man who doesn't have a spouse or a mother, they kind of oftentimes have no one to
Hmm.
process it with, which is so, so tragic because when men try to go to other men to process it, often the man that they're going to has no idea how to hold space for
Oh yeah,
them.
yeah.
And there are men out there who do know how to hold space and who do know how to have those feelings and sit in that discomfort. And I'm absolutely not saying that every man doesn't, but I'm saying this is a common phenomenon of men trying to get support from other men, it not working, so them making the pathway in their brain that doesn't work, so they don't try again.
Yeah. So they may be more likely to turn inward instead of expressing outward, and then more likely to try to manage it on their own,
Yeah.
instead of turning to other people or other resources, even books. And it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting along this same dynamic axis, if you will, because they're more likely to express or share or cry with someone else, process with someone else, women tend to, or there is a tendency for some, if not maybe a lot of women, to experience isolation in their grief because maybe their support system isn't built to support them enough during a grieving process, or their people aren't sharing how they feel enough, or they're not getting enough calls for, hey, do you need to talk? You can talk to me. And so there can be this, even though they tend to want to and or maybe have better training to express themselves more outward, they at least express a tendency to experience more isolation.
You're saying women do that?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
even though they have, and I think it's because they have the drive and the training to express outward and to share with others, and there isn't enough of a network that can hold it. Is sort of
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line. Whether it's people who flood in initially and then kind of disappear as we're continuing to grieve, or they don't know how to do grief support, so they're offering inept support, and so the women though they would love to process with someone, aren't getting met with the kind of network that can manage that kind of processing with them. For instance, they may be trying to go to their male partner, their men partner, who isn't doing the talking and who isn't like holding space for a lot of processing, and so they, like again, report feeling isolation. Whereas
Hmm.
men who are likely to be more isolated report isolation less because of their training. They're not looking for it out there, so they don't report thinking there's not enough of it out there.
I see what you're saying. That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. So then women also, they will try to connect with others where men don't tend to. They're more likely to go and get resources and support outside of their, immediate network if they need to. And they're also more likely to express some frustration with others' inability to share or help them process their grief.
Hmm.
Which I
Hmm.
found really interesting as I dug into the research around it. Like, oh yeah, like you get the training to do more expressing. So if there isn't enough of a support network, you're going to notice it a lot more.
Versus already being accustomed to not having a support network, so not being
Got your
disappointed
blinders. Yeah.
because you've been so conditioned since
Yeah.
6 years
Nobody
old.
helps me with any of my feelings. So yeah, I'm not going to even be looking for that.
Yeah. Wow.
Which
Wow.
That's really fascinating to me.
That's a
Yeah.
lot for me to take in.
Yeah.
That's super fascinating.
One of the other things that I came across was the impulse to move back toward what they consider normalcy. Men report like or seem to want to tend to want to get back to what they think of as normal faster. Just go back to work, get back into their projects, get back into other things besides engaging with the emotional experience of the grief. Whereas women tend to, at least from the research that they've done so far, seem to be more willing to allow for a longer term engagement with their grief,
Hmm.
slower to like force themselves back to normal.
So there's more emotional bypassing, you would say, with men.
Yeah, great way to encapsulate it. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
even just like emotional ignoring, like not even just like, oh, it's okay, or it all works out for the best, or they're in a better place. They may do some of that, but they may also just be back to work,
Yeah. Yeah.
which I feel such compassion and sadness around anybody too quickly trying to force themselves back to any sense of normalcy or back to work or back to, operating as they would otherwise.
Hmm.
I keep saying normalcy, recognizing that there is no going back to normal. And that's sort of what all my air quotes are about. But a lot of other grievers don't know that, right? They think,
Hmm.
oh, if I just go back to work, then I'll get back to normal. Well, we'll just like it'll all smooth out eventually.
I agree with you 100% that people trying to bypass their grief to go back to quote normal is harmful to them. But can we go into why?
Yeah. And part of the reason I'm using the air quotes so much is because you and I know for sure there's no going back to what was before. Like we can,
Yeah.
even if we just put ourselves right back in the same positions and same habits and same routines, we're different. Especially if, I mean, I say it that way because that's certainly my experience. And I think the lion's share of the experience of people who are having a significant loss, right? But there may be other grieving processes that you go through that are much smaller, much easier, much faster back to or much closer to an original normalcy than other grieving processes, right, that are more effective for us. But for those big ones, there's definitely no going back to who we were before. And so there's no going back to what was normal before.
And so to try to go back to quote normal is actually just a denial of reality,
Mm.
which doesn't help the actual reality to be more pleasant. It's just to live in denial. And it's denial of self, of denying who you are as a changed person who has changed via grief, as well as who, like, what life is like now without that person.
I would say even regarding who that person was to us. Right? If they're a really important person to us, at least to me, the idea of everything just going back to normal now that they're suddenly gone, or however, whatever the process was for their, passage, now that they're gone, it doesn't make sense to me if they're a significant person in our lives for us to just go back to whatever we were like before, because that person mattered so much to who we are or who we were before.
Yeah. This conversation reminds me so much of a phrase that I use all the time, which is that the patriarchy hurts everyone.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's a lot of rhetoric around how women are so oppressed because of the patriarchy, which is true. And it doesn't give justice to all of the oppression that men also face because of the patriarchy, not because of equality movements, but because of them not being allowed to feel feelings and not being allowed to
Get support or be vulnerable, even be
yeah.
authentic. Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're absolutely
Hmm.
right. And the research bears that out. The I won't go into all of the research of more negative outcomes for men, but there's a lot of it. Especially health outcomes, especially longevity and those kinds of things, chronic illnesses. But even in especially around grief, men are more likely to die after the loss of a partner than women are. We're more likely to have chronic heart disease after significant grief. I mean, people with penises, because of the training we get, because of the even
Yeah.
because I think because of the way our endocrine system is a little bit different. I don't think our brains are that different, but I think our hormone systems can be quite different. And the emphasis that male bodied person's endocrine system has on androgen or testosterone, I think also can increase the negative outcomes around significant loss. In part because one of the things that happens with testosterone is you amp up for protection. And when someone you love or who's really close to you dies and your endocrine system amps up for protection, that's really hard on the nervous system, really hard on the body.
Yeah.
So it takes a toll.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we got into this, both because of the impact that a grieving process can have on a person, and I think the impact that it can have on men who don't get trained or get as much support, having skills, or get offered as much support. I think the outcomes can be worse for them. I think that's a really important part of this conversation, but also what you're bringing in around normalcy, which is we haven't really discussed elsewhere. And I don't know. I think there are some gender differences here too, but it's really important for us in this space to emphasize the point that however we're navigating, however we're processing, whatever category we happen to be in, and however that affects how we process, if we're significantly affected by the grief or by this particular loss of a person, then it's worth us having the concept that normal is not what we're looking for anymore. We're
Hmm.
looking for moving forward. Looking for how we have a new relationship with ourselves and with our grief and with the person that has passed, but not going back to normal. I think that's like you're saying. I think it can be actually a disservice to think that that's what we're supposed to do.
Hmm. Hmm. And the lack of feeling the feelings creates that fallacy of going back to normal.
Yeah.
So, through feeling the feelings comes the realization that it's a new paradigm, that the old normal's never coming back, and to grieve the fact that it's never coming back.
Yeah. Yes. And recognizing too that if you're like a typical man or if you're like a typical woman, then your relationship to the normalcy will be different.
Hmm.
Your relationship to how strong the drive is to go back to what was before, or how what your normal has been up to this point might be stronger for men. The sense of needing to get this grieving process wrapped up and get on with life might be also stronger with men. But I think
Hmm.
there's whether you are in one of those categories or supporting someone in one of those categories, that's really worth knowing.
So we've talked a lot about the disadvantages of being someone socialized to be a man as a griever. Did you come across any disadvantages of people socialized to be women as grievers?
Well, there is that sense of because they're more likely to be outward or to process outward, then if their support network isn't there, they're more likely to experience that and to not like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do, or at least in the research that I came across, you do hear more women, like I say, reporting frustration, reporting a sense of isolation, reporting needing more network. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't see that necessarily as a deficit that women then experience because of their training, as much as it is a deficit of the support systems we have. Like, I think it's fine to train people all,
Mm-hmm.
and it'd be great if we were doing it for all people to express our feelings and to process with each other, because that's really useful for nervous systems to process with other nervous systems.
Yeah.
So if it's a deficit, I think it falls back on a deficit of the culture that needs to be offering more support, especially to people in grief.
Something that also comes to mind for me is that in a lot of heteronormative households where there's a man and a woman, spouse or boyfriend and girlfriend living together, often the woman is doing a lot more domestic labor
And emotional labor.
and emotional labor. Thank you. And in cases of grieving, that is certainly going to be harder for her to find the time to grieve
Yes, yes.
when she is so burdened with the domestic and emotional labor of the household and the partnership. Even if there's children, then much more so, but if there's not children, even still.
Yeah, I'm surprised that didn't show up in the research because I know that's really prevalent out
Yeah.
there. And it may just be because of the way that they were framing the questions when they're asking about, like the experience of these women versus men. But absolutely, that's got to be happening because one of the main things that's such a struggle for someone in a deep grieving process is that life is continuing on alongside of it. So while we're really focused on this other thing that matters so much to us, there's this tension of like, I'm losing stuff, or this stuff needs to happen. Whether it's laundry or shopping or to-do lists of other sorts or home repairs or your work outside the home with if you have clients or employees or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So absolutely, both domestic labor and emotional labor tend to be higher for women, and so in a grieving process, they may have the experience of a lot more work, especially
Mm-hmm.
if they're co-grieving with a
With their
partner.
partner that they live with. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're probably taking on a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably supporting their partner
Mm-hmm.
via cooking and feeding them
Yeah.
and cleaning the home
Yeah.
and not having the time for their own grief while the
Yes.
partner is sitting there unable to access their emotions in the first place.
Yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
quite tragic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this dynamic that you're touching on right here can be such a challenge that this is probably why many partners going through grief together wind up splitting up. We like
Mm.
this is I think it's one of the most tragic the scenarios, but so often when parents lose a child together, it's also the end of their relationship because
Wow.
they can't navigate the very dynamic that you're talking about right there,
Yeah.
and they don't have enough support from the outside to help them get through it, so they can't do it together. It's so
That's
painful.
so, so tragic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and Center for Emotional Education
So we talked about these different tendencies in the two categories, like how they tend to experience or navigate. But I want to also bring in a little bit of the different coping strategies because I think this can also be helpful for folks, whether you're in one of the categories or supporting someone in one of these two categories. So from the research that I came across, I'll start with men. They tend to try to cope with their grief by doing tasks or projects. Get into they might be doing it for a distraction or kind of release, like exercise or like doing something in the yard, but they may also just be trying to busy themselves, right? Getting back to projects or tasks that they know need to be done and are doing anything but engaging with their grief. They may also be more likely to try to take control of others' needs, like try to make sure that they're taking control of the finances to make sure everybody's all secure. Or they maybe jump in to try to plan the funeral, or they may jump in to do more household things, even though we were talking about the opposite tendency that some men will double down on their chores. Again, as a way to increase the relative security in the house or in the space or in their own experience.
I do that.
Yeah, but also as a
Yeah.
way to busy themselves. Do you want
Yeah.
to say more about your experience?
Oh, yeah. I just definitely get a bit obsessively cleaning of my home when I'm
Mm-hmm.
in periods of grief as
Yeah,
an effort to try to control what I can.
yeah, yeah. I experienced this mostly in the early kind of acute phase of my grieving, especially when Edward died, because it was like I was so destabilized on a survival level that I was doing anything I could that seemed to equate to some more level of security. I was
Yeah.
locking doors. I was, I was doing weather stripping. I was like, like anything I could think, and even things that didn't make any sense that were related to security. Getting up and going downstairs and looking to see if I could figure out what that bump I heard was when I was in bed, like instead of just like, I don't know, it was a bump. I'm going to go back to sleep now.
Yeah.
So I can relate to that idea too.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, men tend to work more. They may go back to work sooner, or they may actually increase their workload as a way to get away from the grieving process.
I think I hear a lot of people use the phrase, "Oh, I'm keeping busy," which is good because if I wasn't busy, I would be a mess.
Yep. Oh man, yeah, that exact phrasing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've heard so many people say that across the gender
Yeah.
sphere. I think that is kind of a trope in general for us, especially
Yeah.
when we don't have more skills or more acumen or more of a sense of knowing what we're doing, engaging with our discomfort.
Mhm.
Other things that I came across in my research that men try to do in terms of coping is like getting into activities with others, loved ones or friends or other social groups, but again, busying themselves, but with their people, like they're
Mhm.
not going to process, but hey, let's go play some golf, you know, and or trying to cope by isolating themselves, like just whether it's on the end of I don't want to bring my upset to my other people, so I'll just keep it over here, or I don't, or not having skills for expressing it with others, or not wanting to engage with it at the level of sharing it. So just like go be alone. Um,
Mhm.
it may even come too from a fear of losing control of their emotions.
Mhm.
You often hear people of all identities will apologize for their crying. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It just really got to me. And you're like, well, yeah, you're grieving. Of course, there's going to be some tears. You don't have to apologize to that for me. But that can be another thing of this fear of losing ourselves to the grief in front of someone else.
Mhm.
There's also, and I'm going to put this I want to make sure we put this link in the show notes for this one. It's called Understanding the Way Men Grieve. I put it in, I want to put it in the show notes. And even though there's not a balanced one for the way women grieve for this particular piece, but just because it's fairly exhaustive and pretty much everything they say that they're understanding from their research of the way men grieve, the opposite is true for the way they are finding that women grieve. But so I want to make sure we put that link in there. But another little chunk from that was that, or from that source, is that the research suggests that men appear to be more susceptible to leaning on substances, alcohol, or other substances as part of their coping mechanism, or increasing some risk-taking behaviors following a loss.
Mm-hmm.
More likely than women to do that, supposedly, and also more likely to commit suicide following the death of a spouse.
Mm.
And then, like we're saying, too, more likely to lean on strategies of avoidance, in intellectualization or minimalization of their experience. Oh, it's not that bad. I'm getting through it, or I'm finding my way, or I'm going to be all right eventually. They tend to say those things instead of, it's so fucking hard. I'm really having a terrible time. And there also may be, or there's some research that's showing a higher tendency for men to have physical symptoms or to somaticize their emotion, whether it's through an increase in physical pain or increase in physical illness. Even though following the loss of a spouse, women tend to be more likely to experience what they call broken heart syndrome. It's myocardial Takotsubo or something like that is the official name, where a ventricle of the heart actually swells, and they are more susceptible to heart attacks. But it's actually men who wind up dying more often from that scenario, even though they're less likely to have the broken heart syndrome.
Yeah, so that's all examples of the body manifesting the unprocessed feelings, right?
Yeah, yeah, and trying to work it out, or brain it out instead of feeling it out.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's actually research proving that people who are not processing their feelings are physically getting life-threatening, if not life-ending illnesses
Mm-hmm.
because
Or
of it.
being, yeah, or finding, like that higher instance of suicide tells me that they're, even though they're not engaging with it or trying to process it, there's still this massive effect that's going on internally that could drive them to a choice like that, even, or
Yeah.
to a reaction like that, even if it's not a full
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit then about what the research is showing about women, how they tend to try to cope. As
Yeah.
I was sort of saying already, and as you might guess, there's a lot of opposition here, a lot of binary, polar. So they tend to try to cope by talking about their grief, right? Sharing it with their friends, sharing it with their family, and not trying to just keep it internal or process it on their own. They're
Mm-hmm.
more likely to try to cope by seeking some support, both inside and outside the family, or inside or outside their immediate support group or network. They're more likely to like go to an actual grief support group outside the home, or to get counseling of some kind, or take a class, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Women are more likely to try to cope by creating some new social supports. Again, I think leaning back on that understanding that because they process more outwardly, if they're not having enough sources to do the processing outward, they'll experience that frustration. And so then they go looking, okay, well, you guys can't do it. I'm going to go find some people who can. They're much more likely to go and find other social networks or create new ones.
Mm-hmm.
And more likely to, it turns out, to seek others who can understand their specific loss, which is kind of an interesting detail of the data that I guess if men do go to support groups, they're less, however much, less likely to go to a specific support group rather than a general support group for grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just mention here that you and I both recommend that if you're going to go to a support group, well, definitely go to one. If if you can't, if
Yeah.
if you don't have enough support, go to a support group. But if you can, find one that is specific, because there are people there who will know more about what you're going through if they've been through the same kind of loss, right?
Yeah, you'll be able to bond with the people more. You'll get a lot more applicable advice on coping strategies from people who have the same either manner of death or manner of relationship.
Well, and I remember from your story too, where even though the people you sought out were in a different demographic, like they were tended to be older people who had lost
Mm-hmm.
their mothers, women who'd lost their mothers, that was
Mm-hmm.
still very supportive because they knew what it was like to lose their mothers, even though they were, had 10, 20, 30, 40 years on you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, finding support groups that know about the kind of grieving that you're doing can be really even more helpful.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things that I've found in the research was that women may be more likely to try to cope by questioning or blaming others. They may question their relationship with their partner if they're unable to share their grief and work through it. They're more likely to leave a partnership if they have the sense that their spouse isn't being able to be with them in their grief. Whereas men
Wow.
are more likely to be like, well, yeah, I'm trying to get through it on my own. I know she's got a lot on her plate already.
Mm-hmm.
Women.
I like your imitation of men. Go on, go on.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Just the I see that as probably why grieving partnerships are susceptible to breakup. If the man isn't trained, and these are in heteronormative, not same gendered relationships. If the man is not talking about it, not processing outward, trying to get back to normal, trying to stay busy, trying to like be internal and not shake anybody else up by losing it in front of them, then on the one hand, the woman in that partnership isn't going to have the sense of being supported by them, but they're also going to have the sense of, you're not going through the same grief I am.
Mm-hmm.
You're just getting back to this isn't even affecting you at all. Who are
Did you
you?
even love them?
Yeah, get out of here.
Yeah.
Like I can just really
Yeah.
identify with that level of
Yeah.
alienation that can happen when you see that the person is doesn't look like they're going through the same process that you are. So women
Yeah.
trying to cope tend to be more likely to question or blame the others, their partner or their other support group people. Also, this was an interesting piece. They in this research seemed to find that women were more likely to try to cope by expressing grief through writing, reading and writing, journals, stories, books, and expressing that way, all being ways of helping to reduce their sense of isolation.
Wow.
So even though they would love to be able to talk about it with their support group, even having a book helps them seems to, in terms of their coping, has at least is reported to have helped them navigate some of that
Mm-hmm.
experience of not having enough support.
Mm. Wow.
I found that really interesting,
Yeah.
and in thinking about too how these differences really can affect the outcomes that these two groups experience, or individuals in these two groups can experience.
Well, we know that women live longer than men do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that women go through more grieving and losses than men do. I wonder if this has anything to do with that.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on it earlier in that men aren't just, we're not just men or people with penises aren't just trained to relate to grieving in this way, or to not relate to their grieving in this way, but all emotional processing, and
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
you're saying, they get reduced to one category, or one small range of emotion that or it's okay for you to have. But really, I mean, even that comes with such potent caveats. Like, you're allowed to have anger because that's kind of manly, and then you can go and protect your women folk with that, or your family with that anger power, but only if you're not scary at your people. If you're angry and your anger is loud or it's boisterous or it has physicality, then you better tamp that down around me. If you're not going out to attack the other people that we want you to attack, you don't be bringing that in here.
Yeah.
So then they get really like trapped in an experience of not having any training, not having very many skills, not having very much support, and so not being able to engage or process or release very many of their feelings.
Hmm.
And so I think, sure, around grief, they're definitely carrying a lot more, and that's probably having negative outcome on their life expectancy or their quality of life after the grieving experience. And that's happening to them every day with all their feelings.
I wonder if it is even possible for someone to do research around the topic of people who identify as men who have learned how to feel their feelings. What are their health outcomes compared to the general male population?
Yeah. I can't wait for that research. Yeah.
I feel like it'll come one day, but
Yeah.
it's a slow burn.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think I mean, I definitely think you're right in terms of how not having skills, training, or support to engage with our grief or engage with grief can affect men and their health outcomes more significantly following a grieving process than women because of the skills and the training and the support that is more likely to be available for women.
Hmm.
And again, I think that's across the board with all the emotions for men, but also I think you see it in grieving, particularly because the emotional volume can be so high, and so then the negative physical outcomes can be starker, quicker, more obvious.
Yeah.
Like just like the higher rates of suicide for men after losing a partner.
Yeah.
I think that's directly related to the fact that especially when they lose their partner, well, then they have no one to talk to about their feelings. No one who's even
Yeah.
going to be like, "Are you doing okay?"
Hmm.
Or at least not after the initial, week or two. Six
Yeah.
weeks, I think, is one time you mentioned.
Yeah. When people fall off.
Fall off, yeah.
What about same sex couples?
Yeah, I think this is it's important to mention. We did not. I went looking specifically because I'm non-binary. I did
Hmm.
not find any research that is specifically looking at how or any differences in how non-binary folks or people who don't identify as men or women. I want to say regardless of the training they got, but we don't. There's not enough research yet to show significant differences in how people outside of the gender binary relate to or process or try to cope with their grief. But one really significant piece of data that I did find, as you're saying, was on same gendered partners.
Hmm.
So, men when they're in relationship to each other and women when they're in partnership with each other. And I'm thinking specifically of like intimate partnership, not just, you know, co-worker or, like partners in a entrepreneurial thing or
Yeah, you're talking
part.
about romantic life partners who are
Yes.
very
Thank you.
likely living together,
Yes.
cohabitating, uh,
Thanks so much for
whether or
helping me
not
with that.
there's marriage.
Right.
Yeah.
Those same gendered partners, when they lose their partner specifically, they report significantly higher and more psychological distress
Hmm.
than different gendered partners who lose a partner.
Uh-huh.
And I think research does do some guessing about why that might be. I think the most compelling guess, and they intimated in this research, but I don't think they make it clear enough. I think probably the most likely reason for some of that, or maybe it's the biggest part of that, is that is the difference in community. Same gendered partners, they have a much tend to have a more closed community, right? They have like their
Hmm.
other queer friends, their other people who accept their queer partnership.
Hmm.
Like it's a kind of select. community or select culture, whereas
Mm-hmm.
heteronormative, people who are in different gendered partnerships and that heteronormity and the rest of the culture just sees that already and is,
Yeah.
accepting of that and celebrates that and emphasizes that. And so I think there tends to be a sense of, even irrespective of these two the gender differences we've been talking about so far, there tends to be a sense of more support, more understanding, more acceptance for your loss if it's within the heteronormative, binary.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a queer couple and you lose your partner, there's, I think, a sense of there's already less support because the culture doesn't value your partnership.
Yeah. It doesn't validate it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that loss, I think, is just I think it comes as a greater loss for that individual nervous system, not
Yeah.
even just culturally or cognitively, but the nervous system reads it as like, oh no, like not just my special person, but my special person in this sort of rarefied environment of getting to have a special person.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's interesting research out there that seems to show that same gendered bereaved partners are experiencing more psychological distress.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think I'm so glad appreciate you mentioning or inviting me to mention it here. I definitely wanted us to make it part of this conversation because, there's a lot of same gendered folks out there who are maybe tuning into this conversation and hearing, okay, if men do it this way, women do it that way, but know that your same gendered partnership is likely to, if there's something that happens for the two of you, you're likely to experience it. Or people that you love who are in same gendered partnerships who lose their partner are likely to experience it with more distress as a bigger
Mm-hmm.
loss.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really need to circle around our people who are in same gendered partnerships where
Mm.
they're bereaved.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, thank you. Yes.
And all of us. I mean, like, I think the bottom line, I say for us because I know that you share it too, but like, we all need some more support. No matter
Yeah.
how you identify, no matter what group you got put in when you were born and how you got raised or acculturated or whatever kind of training you got, every single one of us going through a grieving process can use more support.
Yeah. Yes. We all can.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to just underscore that these are kind of what we described as like what men go through and what women go through in their grief. These are kind of the pitfalls of the gender binary that we're socialized to be a part of. And the way out of these specific ones is for everyone to accept that the fact that they have a range of emotions and to learn how to emotionally process them and to be open to support, to look for support, to receive the support, regardless of gender. And then
Yeah.
on the other side, to make sure there's equal distribution of labor at all times and during grief for the griever to perhaps if there's a cohabitating partnership where one person is grieving more than the other for the not less grieving or non-grieving partner to level up in the 6 months 12 months following the death to really take on more of the domestic and emotional labor of the partnership. And
Yeah.
if it's a co-grief, then to make sure it's certainly equal and to get as much outside support as possible.
Yeah. Yes. I couldn't agree more. I definitely think everything you're saying there is so important from, making sure that I think even as a culture, begin to break up this delineation, and where we're training this group this way and this group this way
Mm-hmm.
around feelings processing. I don't think that's
Yeah,
really serving any of us
it's
anymore,
not.
if it ever did. So, in a general sense, getting rid of that, but then especially around grieving too, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that for ourselves, like we have there's a wide range of experiences we can have, like you're saying, and there's a lot of support that any one individual needs,
Yeah.
regardless of how you identify. And if you're supporting someone else, same thing. Like, don't just think, well, they're a man and so men do it this way, I guess I won't ask him how he's doing. I won't
Hmm.
ask him about his grief because men don't talk about it. No, like just because this is the what we've seen in the tendencies based on the programming we have doesn't mean that that's the healthy way to do it. So,
It's
looking
not.
right,
We're here to proclaim it is an unhealthy way to do it.
that's right.
And we have the ticket to the better way.
Yes. And so, yeah, like looking for ways that we can support both of these two genders that we're talking about and anyone across the gender sphere
Hmm.
in ways that are obvious, in ways that meet them where they are, and in ways that don't expect them to continue to sort of toe the cultural line for how they're supposed to navigate this. And then I think also what you were saying about the division of labor, I think absolutely, I think that's a really important thing to look at and to assess if you're in a partnership and one of you is going through a grieving process, then yeah, absolutely looking for where you can lean in to support them with things that they might otherwise do, or like making sure that you're really contributing at a level that is equitable
Hmm.
given that scenario and that season.
Hmm.
If you're both going through a grieving process, then yeah, I think too, looking for how do we navigate it in a way that's right for each of us navigating our process. And that might be, let's just make sure everything is really split. Like, I don't want you doing more of the domestic labor because I know you're doing a lot of emotional labor too. So I'm going to take on a little bit more of the domestic stuff that normally we just let you do for whatever reason. I'm just going to take on more of it so that you are doing less, whichever partner you are, right?
Hmm.
I think that's a useful way to approach, but I also think, and this is where it really comes down to like working with your partner and what's going to work best for each of you and your partnership. But for some partners navigating a grieving process, whether they're in it together or just one of them is going through it and the other one's looking for how to support, it might be that, let's say you just happen to be the partner, regardless of gender, you happen to be the partner that tends to do more of the domestic labor in the house, and the other one tends to do more of the emotional labor. Let's just say that's the way it happens to be for the two of you. It might be that for the grieving process, you want to switch that up a little bit to even it out, but it might be that you actually want to stay even more in your categories so that you can do it the way that is right for you and is right for your partner too. Like if it's
Hmm.
really this sort of matching of how we're going to get through it together. And I think two people going through a grieving process at the same time and trying to navigate it together is so challenging because each one needs so much. And it's really difficult at any one point to also be the person providing that for the other person. And so I think the odds are really stacked against them in a way. It's really, and so I think
Hmm.
the emphasis needs to be on really getting tremendous amounts of support for the couple. And if you know someone who's a couple going through it, like really circling the wagons around them and helping them to marshal support because they're both going to need so much. But then also, as much as they're able to, really each one of them and together the duo finding the rhythms and the division of labors that is going to help them get through this season. And like you're saying, it may mean that they shift things for the time being, or it may mean that they, like I'm saying, double down on what they tend to do for the season. And again, emphasizing that it's for this season. Right?
Hmm. Well, and I think that's something that so many non-monogamous couples have an advantage to monogamous couples is the increased level of intimate partner support. Because very rarely is the entire polycule grieving the same exact person.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I don't know if it's a whole nother episode or not, but I really want you to say more about that because that's such an important difference between, monogamous or, smaller units of partnership
Yeah.
versus polyamorous ones, larger units of partnership. Just that one piece of like, oh, like we have more opportunities for support because we have a larger group of us who love each other and are
Hmm.
taking care of each other and are intimate with each other.
Hmm. And that can happen through family, and that can happen through friend groups, and that can happen through polycues. And I have observed that queer polycues tend to be the chosen family of someone's life that tends to step
Yeah.
in those times when this is kind of in that situation of the queer partnership being in more distress from losing their partner, that if that's a polyamorous dynamic, the queer polycue can tend to be there and provide that support a lot more that perhaps the biological family would not, because of the unacceptance of the queerness or the polyamory.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's such an important nuance. I'm so glad that you mentioned it. And I think it really does belong here, even though we're talking about these gender differences. That's been the sort of main emphasis of this conversation. This is a place where, those differences kind of get bent,
Mm-hmm.
either through queerness or not identifying with the binary or being in a relationship that is not heteronormative. I think those relationships can really affect how any one person will navigate their grieving process. I think
Yeah.
along those lines, even though we're not finding research on it, just speaking from my own experience, it's worth saying just a sentence or two, at least to acknowledge the non-binary experience that I think for many of us pulls from both of these two categories because we only have so many training methods for people in our culture so far, and I think we're expanding them. We're getting smarter about this. We're growing, we're learning, and we're breaking up this old dynamic of just either or. But that's still pretty prevalent in our parenting and in our child rearing in schools and things like that. And so, as a non-binary person in this kind of body, I got a lot of training in the men category, and how to handle feelings that way. But because my identity is different than that locale, I found myself navigating my grief. Of course, everyone is going to navigate their grief in their own way, but navigating as I read these two categories, I'm like, oh, I do some of that and I do some of that. And oh, I try to cope that way and I also try to cope that way. And I I don't lean on my network enough, but damn, I wish I had more network. So I think just speaking from my own experience and again having the training that I got most of my life as a non-binary person, I found myself really seeing that I pull from both of these two training categories, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that a lot of non-binary folks will have that experience and or find themselves leaning more toward the training that they got because that's really what this boils down to.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of the way we identify, however our body was categorized when we were growing up, we're more likely to get that category of training. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
There's a steeper curve of unlearning that has to take place of
yeah,
the socialization we received as children.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you come into contact with it more, like in the within the gender binary, and especially within the heteronormative end of the gender binary, if you will. There's fewer opportunities to come to terms with our programming because we're just in the culture that ratifies that programming all the time, and so you don't even see it. Whereas when you're outside of that, in whatever ways, then it's more like, oh, this is how we get trained to do this stuff. Okay, and that doesn't gel with me. Whatever. So I have a sense that folks outside of the binary and wherever you fall, I say non-binary I as a general way to refer to it. I specifically identify as omnigender, and so that's I think where I might be part of why I have a sense of pulling from both categories of the two that we've
Mm-hmm.
been talking about, as
Mm-hmm.
well as other categories that we haven't talked about. Other non-binary identifying folks may find themselves leaning more toward one or the other, or toward a possibility that is not one of these two. I just want to, I don't know, claim that terrain for all of us who aren't in the gender binary.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal experience with it. I think that is definitely going to resonate with a lot of listeners.
Great. Well, thanks so much for this discussion. I think this is really so useful for anyone listening, but especially as you're trying to figure out, like, how do I do my grief?
Yeah.
Recognizing some of the programming you may have gotten.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. Thanks for doing all the research.
Yeah, that's my turn.
I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.